Now, let me start this out with a warning that there will be spoilers for the latest episode of The Mandalorian, which is episode 5 of season 2, so if you haven't seen it yet and you don't want anything ruined, it's a really good time to click away. Okay, so where to even begin? I feel like there was so much in this episode to talk about that I'm going to miss a few things, so sorry in advance, but I think we should probably start with Ahsoka. And first of all, that opening sequence with her was awesome to behold. Honestly, didn't expect this episode to kick off with her, especially with her in action, but not upset that it did. I really thought it was going to be a slow build to finding her, and then it'd basically end with Din Djarin showing her the child. Excuse me, I mean Grogu. He finally has a name, and we'll talk a lot more about that in a bit. Anyway, I thought it'd take most of the episode to find her, and that it'd end with a sort of cliffhanger, and we wouldn't really learn too much just yet. But again, that obviously didn't happen, and I'm glad it didn't. I'm glad we got a full episode of Ahsoka, because I get the sense that could be the last we see of her this season, and maybe in the show for a while. I could be wrong about that, who knows, though I certainly think there's a really, really good chance we'll be seeing more of her elsewhere. I think it's only a matter of time before they announce Ahsoka is getting her own show, or will be a big part of some other show. As for the way she looked, I'll be honest, maybe a little jarring at first to see her in live action. Not saying she looked bad at all, or that Rosario Dawson didn't do a great job. I think she did. But after only seeing Ahsoka in animation for all these years, and to not have the voice of Ashley Eckstein attached to it, it took a bit of getting used to, and all around, it wasn't perfect. Not that I expected it to be or demanded it to be. There's obviously going to be some give and take if you want to bring a character like Ahsoka into live action. One thing that did impress me quite a bit, though, was that Dawson managed to capture a lot of Ahsoka's little looks and mannerisms really well. I also loved the score or music in this episode. I loved hearing some of Kevin Kiner's work mixed in there, and he, of course, did both Clone Wars and Rebels. And I don't know how much of her own stunts Dawson did or who did them, but I thought all around they did a good job of bringing what we know and have seen in animation to be a very nimble, fluid, and graceful character into live action in a believable way, and as good as I think they could have done, all things considered. Again, this wasn't going to be absolutely perfect, but they did really well. And though I thought most of the action was really, really good in this episode, especially that brief fight between Mando and Ahsoka, I thought that was awesome. I did find it a bit curious that the Magistrate character went toe-to-toe with Ahsoka in combat and held her own for so long. I mean, maybe it's a nitpick, but we have seen Ahsoka go against full-on Sith Lords. We've seen her up against the likes of Maul, Ventress, and even Darth Vader himself. She even makes short work of 2 Inquisitors in Rebels. So it really makes me wonder who this Magistrate is exactly, and if maybe she's Force-sensitive or something. Though I suppose you do want some tension or drama for the climactic final act or battle of the episode, and it should also be noted that Ahsoka was likely holding back to some degree, because she wasn't trying to kill her, she wanted to get information from her. Though she didn't hold back from killing anyone else, she was actually quite brutal in this episode. Not saying she hasn't been that way before, but maybe it feels a bit different in live action over animation, I don't know. Another thing I found kind of interesting was at no point did she say she wasn't a Jedi, which is something she's gone out of her way to say before. And sure, maybe she didn't because she doesn't want to confuse Din Djarin, or it doesn't really matter what he believes about her. Also could be that they didn't want to confuse those watching who maybe don't know all that much about the character, who don't know Ahsoka's story. Either way, I think it was worth noting she never did say she wasn't a Jedi. It was also rather interesting that she refused to train Grogu because of his attachment to Din Djarin, and I loved the subtle reference to Anakin when she mentions what can happen to even the greatest Jedi when they form attachments, which in turn makes her stance on not wanting to train him make perfect sense. I was okay with how this all played out, and I really loved all the joy she gets from seeing Grogu or seeing another one of Yoda's species, and I like that they could sort of communicate with each other, that baby Yoda maybe isn't so much of a baby after all. Not that he would be at 50 years old, but I think you know what I mean. I then have to admit I chuckled a little bit to myself when Ahsoka talked about the Force, and that it takes a great deal of training and discipline to wield it. And then we also learned that Grogu had training, that he grew up in the Jedi Temple, and apparently had several masters, and that it seems even a member of Yoda's species can't just naturally use the Force to great extent without training, which I don't know, feels like maybe a small jab at the sequel trilogy, where a certain character could do all sorts of things without much training whatsoever. And speaking of all that, of the sequels, as you may know in my last few videos, I've been talking a lot about something I call the Felony Verse, or the idea that going forward, they're really going to embrace many of the characters and ideas introduced originally in Clone Wars, or ideas from the movies that were explored further in that series. And a lot of those ideas and characters were then sort of carried forward into Rebels, and now it seems pretty clear they're being carried forward again into The Mandalorian. And in my last video, I even threw out the idea or thought, hey, what if Gideon is reporting to someone else above him, and what if that's Thrawn? What if they even do something like basically retell the original Thrawn trilogy? Because, as I've argued before, one of the problems with the sequels is it feels like we missed so much of the story. It feels like we missed a whole trilogy worth of story, and if anything, Episode 7 should have actually been Episode 10. And so when Thrawn got name-dropped by Ahsoka, when we learned he was the one she was looking for, and she called him Grand Admiral Thrawn, which I think or hope implies he's still a part of the Imperial Remnant, or the one leading it, and that Gideon maybe reports to him. Anyway, when I heard his name mentioned, I really started to think and hope I could be right about all this, that we're going to see a huge expansion of this time period across multiple shows, and that it will mainly be about or feature these characters and stories that started in Clone Wars and then in Rebels, blended together with maybe other aspects of the expanded universe, and that it could even, who knows, lead to a whole different timeline separate from the sequel trilogy. I mean, when I heard Tython mentioned, I nearly lost my mind. I couldn't help but think, so much for Ahch-To being the site of the first Jedi Temple, or where the Jedi originated from, even though, yes, I'm sure Ahch-To can still be worked into it in any number of ways. And yes, just because Tython is mentioned doesn't mean that everything learned about it in the expanded universe will still hold true. We could easily get a new or different version from the one we once got before. Oh, and speaking of that, I can't help but wonder what Jedi will show up once Grogu is taken to Tython, assuming that's the path the youngster chooses, the path of the Jedi, and that one of them actually does show up. Could it possibly be even Luke Skywalker himself? Could we see him take the child away to be trained? Could it instead maybe be someone like Ezra Bridger, or maybe even Cal Kestis from Jedi Fallen Order? Or will it be some other Jedi that we know about who survived, or maybe even a brand new one we've never met or seen before? There are just so many possibilities right now, so much to be excited about, and so many things going on or brought up by this show in the past few episodes that I now fully believe that, again, they have big plans to expand this time period and start multiple other shows around it. Either that or what this show itself is would have to radically change going forward. It'd have to become something completely different, because you can't just keep using and name-dropping all these characters without fans wanting to see more of them, or all these other plot threads mentioned that would be allowed to play out. I mean, in the first 5 episodes of this season, we've now seen or heard about Boba Fett, Bo-Katan, Ahsoka Tano, and Thrawn. We've also been shown that the Mandalorians want to take back their homeworld, and that the remnants of the Empire are still up to all sorts of nefarious things, and that apparently a Jedi just may come for Grogu. And though I gotta admit that on the surface, or when you put it like that, it does sound like a heck of a lot of fan service is going on, it's so far been handled really well for the most part. Surprisingly well, honestly. And it feels natural. All these characters showing up doesn't feel forced. Again, it feels natural, and also it's very exciting. And for better or worse, what's been done with this show so far has me so much more interested and vested in everything than what the sequel trilogy did. This is continuing the story of Star Wars in a much better and, again, more natural way. And so far it hasn't even used any of the characters from the main storyline or from the saga films, and yet it feels more connected to them somehow. But anyway, here to actually talk about the episode itself a little bit, I thought, removing Ahsoka and all the name drops and everything else that we learn, that it was pretty good in and of itself. The irony of this show, I guess you could say, is that it's sort of doing all this expanding of Star Wars with what are otherwise rather simple and basic individual or self-contained episodes with their own stories, more or less, and that this episode really wasn't much different. I mean, yes, we had a resolution to the child story teased, which is a huge part of the overall story that we've been following, but beyond that, it was just an episode where the good guys liberate a town from the bad guys, all the while we learn a ton of cool stuff, of course. It was also another episode or had a lot of moments between Grogu and Din Djarin, and we fully believe at this point that there is a bond between them, but again, the story in this episode itself was just pretty basic. Which isn't a complaint, nor is the fact that most episodes are pretty basic when it comes to story structure. It's actually a rather clever way, I think, to get people who don't know Star Wars that well, especially the stuff beyond the movies, interested and ready for, again, what I think are going to be more shows that go into these characters and the bigger stories around them. Like I said, I don't see this show, I don't see The Mandalorian itself handling everything that it's introducing, or being introduced in just the first half of this season alone. Again, it would have to radically change from what it has been thus far to cover all this. And speaking of covering all this, I do indeed feel like there's a ton of things I'm forgetting to talk about, though I'm pretty sure this episode will spawn another video or two sometime next week to maybe dig into some of these things a bit more, or to put some more theories out there, or to talk more about what I clearly now believe is the direction they're taking with everything, meaning the whole franchise. That they're going to go all in on this time period and everything being introduced in the show. And so for now, well, that's all I've got for you. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about this episode and everything we saw or had revealed in it. Is this the way? Did you love everything about it? Or were you maybe not all that impressed? Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.